Hello, it is me, Daniel, here with a thoroughly unscripted addendum to the start of this episode. Because, well, unfortunately, there are a lot of technical issues throughout this particular edition of SAB. We have done our best to get rid of them or cover them up, edit them out, what have you, as much as possible, but quite a few of them have still slipped through to the point where, frankly, I was seriously considering not actually putting this episode up at all. I have elected to instead leave it up though, just so if you want to wade through some of the glitches in there, there is still some good content in there that's worth listening to, and that will hopefully add some context to later episodes in the cycle. And I figured this is also a good enough time to throw in a content warning because this being a cycle on crime, we do touch upon some pretty heavy, dark topics throughout this cycle that some people may want to give a miss to. But yeah, with that all out the way, enjoy the recording, I suppose. Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, mechanics, etc., is out unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I'm Daniel Radford, author, kingpin, and also your host, and today I'm joined once more by my partner in crime, John Kernan.
Hi, I'm a raccoon because they wear little masks.
Nice.
Born
In
criminals.
case, in, in in case that little bit there didn't clue you in, or the title of the episode somehow didn't, partner in crime is a fitting description today as we head into our new theme cycle. This time we are focusing on stories about crime.
Everybody loves crime when it's not real slash not happening to them. Lots of fun.
True enough. There are a lot of stories about crime told from the perspectives of detectives, criminals, and victims all. So naturally, this means a story about crime can be just about anything from a mystery to a drama to a thriller, a horror. It all depends largely on the story itself, who your protagonists are, the scale of the crime, and what the author is trying to achieve with the story. But before we delve too deeply into that sort of thing specifically, I thought it would actually be interesting to look into why the fuck we tell stories about crime of all things. It's crime.
Can't help but think that for the most part it just ties in very strongly to all the stuff we've said in the past about drama and how in one form or another humans crave it, but also it's such a consistent thing in real life that as law I get the distinct feeling that crime used to actually be a very boring, maybe even banal thing to people like way back in the day. But as legal systems and laws have gotten more complex, more thoroughly encompassing, and harder to get around in one place or another, that's almost led to stories being born from all the extra convoluted steps and methods criminals use to try to get around laws or get away with the things they want to do.
Yeah, I don't know how stories about crime necessarily were historically. There does seem like a more modern thing that crime thrillers have become so prevalent. But like, you used to have stories about like outlaws in the West and things like that. You had stories about criminals in ancient Greek myth and legend to an extent. Like, it's not like there's never been stories up until about that sort of thing up until the modern day, but it's definitely a much more modern interest. I think you are right about that, and I'm
Yeah,
sure
for the
some of
most
it
part,
is
those old
like
stories
you
where
said.
he was such a badass, nobody could tell him what to do. Wow, what did he do? Kill people, take things. I don't know, whatever he wanted.
No one could stop him. Yeah, I think you're all right about that, and you are right as well. It's just that sort of that weird element of the human psyche obviously does come into play where as an audience, we tend to be attracted to stories that explore those darker elements of the human mind. That's part of the appeal of horror as well, and stories about crime are in that same sort of boat. They present us with a safe way to explore those sort of dark impulses and fantasies and just thoughts in general that most of us keep in check and would never actually go through with.
Yeah, I only just noticed an interesting divide too. All stories are, at least partially reliant on all of the W's, but thinking about it, crime stories are especially and mostly, sometimes to the absence of others, reliant on just two of the W's. Sorry, why, and this one's not a W, but let's just pretend the W is invisible instead of silent. How? It's less important most of
I
the
mean, I would
time.
argue who often comes into play too.
It does. It's just like it's only important because they are the one committing the crime. A lot of times, unless, it's someone who's already famous, we're talking about famous for the crime they're committing. It's like the key parts of the crime are why is it being committed? And if it's an interesting story about the crime itself, how? Well,
Yeah. I
that's
mean,
certainly
I think
heists. Heists are almost all about the how.
very true, yeah. And yeah, I think you're definitely right about that, and that does sort of bring me into the more like from the perspective of the writer side of that, why we tell these stories, because I think there's a lot more to it from that side compared to the audience side, which is just drama good, thriller good, tension good, also safe space to explore kind of messed up stuff. You know,
Yeah, exactly.
you could definitely you could write whole essays on that element of the human mind, but I don't have the know-how or the background to do that, so I have very little to say about it. But
Yeah. People find crime engaging for the same reasons they find most other kinds of stories engaging. But how do writers make it engaging? That's a unique process from other genres.
well, it's not even that. Even beyond how do they make it engaging, right? It's why do we tell those stories to begin with is interesting. Because when I thought about this and I was like, the answer is actually really obvious to an extent. Part of it certainly is, which is crime by definition creates conflict. Conflict between the criminal and the victim, between different criminal enterprises who are in opposition, between prosecutors and defense attorneys, between law enforcement and criminals, between different offenders who have differing ideas about how to commit their crime or feelings about the crime they have just committed. Conflict is baked into the idea of crime by definition, and
That's true.
conflict is also the driving force of the story.
Yeah, all story needs conflict.
It drives the plot forward. It forces characters to interact with each other and with the plot and grow and change as a result. So, with so much potential for conflict baked in to crime, it becomes an excellent basis for storytelling by default.
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of just sitting there waiting.
Yeah. But when you're not when you're just reading a crime book or watching a, movie about a heist or whatever, you don't think about that. But yeah, it's really obvious when you go to the and try to put those dots together, and naturally because of all that conflict, stories about crime also very naturally just come with a lot of tension and stakes built in as well.
Yeah, you'll never see the familiar situation from some other story beginnings of the writer sitting there scratching their head going, okay, okay, now nothing's really happening here yet. How do I introduce some conflict into this crime?
Wait a minute, it's a crime. There's already conflict just because I've introduced crime.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So that's the main sort of Doyleist reason. But there are other reasons as well to tell stories about crime, right? The other primary one being to make a point, to put it bluntly.
It's always good to make a point, and if there's one thing people are going to be very opinionated on one way or the other, it's crime type stuff. So commonly that when nobody has any real opinions on it, you almost look at them and go, "Why?"
Yeah, surely this is something you should have some sort of feeling about. People became victims, were hurt, lost something, or maybe you sympathize with the criminal. And that's exactly the
Yeah.
thing.
How could you feel nothing about a crime? Even if you don't care that the crime was committed, shouldn't that mean you have some sort of thought or feeling about the person who did it and why it was justified, or sympathy for their situation that led them there or something?
Yeah, because stories about crime can show us why certain crimes happen or indicate interesting flaws in our societies, cultures, legal systems, the human condition, or they can pose very interesting hypothetical scenarios to explore in a way that is different to, you know, true crime stories, for example, where you have no control over it. You can only really report the facts. You have control over what you want to explore, and also there's no risk of being exploitative.
Yeah, especially because at its heart, every crime is always really like one of a couple things. It's either someone challenging the system for its own sake because they think they can and they want to beat it, or somebody trying to hurt the system, or from what I've seen at least, the majority of, well, I shouldn't say the majority. The majority of theft and exploitative, like, of the system type crimes are somebody who feels the system has left them no other choice, either to get ahead or in really bad situations to survive.
Yeah, and to be clear, I
But,
don't.
like, it's always something.
Yeah, to be clear, I don't mean to like shit on true crime either. Like I thoroughly enjoy true crime content. It is just
I love true
it is
crime,
what
it's just kinda popcorny.
Yeah, I mean, not even that. There's like even like there is always a risk of accidentally stepping into like the zone of exploitation of victims and things like that. So like it's just a risk you take when you're going into that sort of arena of content.
Ah,
And
yes, we all love how the Netflix Dahmer documentary
mm,
didn't care how the families of any of the victims felt.
yeah, where that is not at all a risk about a fictional crime narrative. You have complete control over the themes you want to explore. There's no risk of really hurting anyone real. It's a good methodology. Like you can explore a lot of the same things, but in ways you wish to explore them. And speaking of those same things, like you can explore a surprisingly diverse number of themes and ideas through a story based on crime. Like just as a couple of notes here, I mean, The Book Thief is all about crimes.
That's true.
It's theft that is born from revenge at first, and later cravings for a resource that is very hard to come by in the setting. But there's also the crime of harboring a Jewish man during the Nazis' reign in Germany. That's technically a crime, but it's a morally correct act.
It's an interesting juxtaposition you can only get from a setting like that, because the things she's doing are generally inherently good things we support and things she should be doing, but they are by definition where she is when she is crimes that could get her entire family slaughtered.
Sometimes crime is a rebellion, and in that case, it is a morally correct thing to do, and then your criminal becomes a hero. And that juxtaposition between morality and legality is a very interesting thing you can explore in a story about crime. A story like Gone Girl, which I covered a little ways back in the other podcast, shows you how basic human flaws in a toxic environment can spiral out of control and eventually lead to criminal behavior. It's a interesting exploration, not just of the execution of the crime, but of how that crime came to be and how it relates to our society and values and things like that. Technically, my book Domino is about a crime. Specifically, it's about the aftermath of a crime, and
It starts with a pretty intense
it's a
crime.
pretty big crime. They do a bit of a terrorism, and the whole point there is to show how ordinary people are affected by the violent actions of others. When you take actions of that scale, because you have the ability to, you're not just affecting the change you want to affect necessarily, or hurting the people you want to hurt. More to the point, you're causing suffering to a much wider range of people who have nothing to do with your vendetta.
Yeah, no matter how you look at it, no matter how justified you feel, you are gonna hurt a lot of people who either have no influence over, or in some cases, no no involvement even in the conflict you're dealing with, and like something like a suicide bombing like that, in a way, some people could even call it kind of cowardly, because I think there's a lot of people who could do some pretty awful, heinous stuff as long as they just have to press a button when you don't have to see the aftermath, when you don't have to deal with it and actually see the people that don't deserve it being hurt by your crimes, seeing the parents crying over dead children, the orphans digging through rubble trying to find remnants of their past life, things like that. Makes it a lot easier on you. A lot easier on you, the whole thing, really, than it is on all those other people that are going to survive it.
That's exactly the thing. Like these are all very interesting, complex things that you can explore through a story about crime. Moral questions, the human condition, all these things that are explorable through this idea of breaking the law. Is it justified? And regardless of if it is justified or not, how does it affect the people who are involved in that crime? How does it affect the victims? How does it affect people who have nothing to do with it in theory?
And even when it is justified and you start from a good place, how long can you keep it up before it gets worse? And will you be able to stop when that time comes?
Yeah. There's just a lot you can do with it because of the all the different types of conflict naturally built in, and because a story about a crime always has something to say about the people who are affected by it from either side of the aisle.
Yeah, it's something. It's a pretty cool thing. I actually ran into some more of it, some philosophizing and thinking on it, just a little while ago. I was watching some videos of somebody analyzing characters from the Mafia series.
Oh, interesting.
It's not a big spoiler, even though it sounds like one, but I'm just gonna say it anyways. Spoilers for anybody who wants to see stuff about Mafia unspoiled. The main character of the first Mafia game, Mr. Tommy, he doesn't really want into the life. He gets invited into the life after some mafia men hold him at gunpoint and force him to be their getaway driver from a shootout. He was just a cabbie before that, and he joins the life, goes through his whole thing. He continues to be, the softy out of the group. He's never willing to just ruthlessly execute people or hurt people who don't deserve it. Meanwhile, even his best friends will not hesitate to pop somebody who's a witness for the sake of the family. And like goes through all that stuff, goes through the life. At the end, decides he can't do it anymore. Sometime after he has a family and starts to see some of the really, really bad stuff going down, and we get this really nice view of him having his future life. He more or less defeats his own crime family, takes down the leader, gets away, and years later we see an old version of him watering his lawn, and then two men walk up to him and say, Don Salieri sends his regards. Pull out a couple guns, and then in Mafia 2, you are playing as one of those two men.
Oh, interesting. I like that. That's a neat little twist.
Yeah, and it's just like sorry, I brought that up partially just to emphasize that like people sometimes think about crime as just a thing you do and don't realize how easily and how strongly it becomes a lifestyle. And when it is a lifestyle, it's an all-encompassing thing. And I was interested to see a story really be willing to emphasize that by being like, yeah, he got to have some time with his family, and his family's probably going to be okay afterwards, but he didn't get away. You can't just get away. Even if it takes 20 years, you live the life of a criminal, a career criminal who doesn't hesitate to kill people. That's who you are, and that's who you will die as.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of all things, like when you talk about speaking of video game series, it actually reminds me of Grand Theft Auto 4 because in that game, Nico, the character you play as, he's a poor war veteran who immigrates into the US, and he has no intention of being a criminal. It's just that it like his economic state and some bad luck effectively get him more and more involved in a criminal lifestyle over time, and then suddenly he's in shootouts with the police and gangs, and so it's another example of that sort of thing of just how the lifestyle kind of consumes a character and how insidious the slip into that lifestyle can be. And I think that is actually a good jumping point to start talking about stories about crime and the perspectives they are told from.
True.
And we may as well. It's out of order in my notes, but who cares? I think that's a good jumping point to actually start with talking about the perspective of the criminal, because typically, right, there's a couple of ways this can go. The most common of which are a reluctant participant who sort of just gets in over their head over time, or even a not reluctant participant, basically someone who gets involved at a small petty level of crime, whether they want to or not, and then it sort of spirals out of control. And then you've also got your sort of charming rogues. Those are your two main like criminal archetypes in fiction. Sometimes you get a story that will be told from the perspective of like a true monster, but that doesn't happen that often because there's that risk of glorifying really terrible acts that people don't want to take.
It's actually kind of inherently hard to make your protagonist hateable or not glorify them or their situation at least a little bit without also just making a boring story. So people often prefer to not make a true monster the main character. On top of that, it's actually a pretty hard writing challenge because by virtue of how differently their minds tend to work from just about any regular person or even other people who are just as bad, it's actually kind of hard to write a monstrous person while being able to see into their head and from their perspective, because those are the jumbled, messy parts that the rest of us don't really understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible, and some people have done
Oh,
it
yeah.
to great effect. Like a very famous example, American Psycho, not admittedly not a bit of media I'm super familiar with, but he's not a great person, and it's still a compelling narrative, even though it's told from his perspective, because the whole point is to get into his head and see why he does the things he does, right?
Yeah, and they do that really well to the point where you don't actually know at the end whether he even killed anybody or not. Those could have been delusional fantasies of his fucked up, repressed mind.
Exactly. Or you've got, I mean, it's a little bit of a column, I guess B and C here, right? But another example is Death Note, because there you have someone who starts committing crimes that are arguably justified, or at least justifiable in their rule system, but then their code, specifically Light's code, starts getting looser and looser and looser as he sinks deeper into his like egotism and tries not to get caught, gets to do his cat and mouse game until he has become the monster. And that is another interesting
Yeah.
angle to explore that from. He starts out killing people who are criminals because he's trying, in his deluded, god complex way, to make the world a better place. But to keep doing that, he finds himself in positions where he has to keep taking out good people, or at least people who don't deserve death necessarily, to stay free and doing that. And in doing so, becomes a bigger monster than most of the people he's killed.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I see it as two things at once. I see Light's Descent as both the the slow boiling frog, although with a god complex frog a couple layers underneath the main frog. God complex comes out pretty fast, almost makes you wonder if it was always there. He just didn't have an excuse. But I also see it almost as a series of ultimatums. Everything is always a series of choices, but it almost feels like, by virtue of what he's doing, everything Light gets into is another not just choice, but ultimatum. He constantly puts him in situations where somebody who doesn't really deserve his wrath will be trying to stop him or in the line of fire or something. and he is constantly forced into a situation where he really his only two options are double down and say he won't let anybody stand in his way or give up and stop altogether. And he's first it's a couple times of no, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to go through with it. And then almost kind of devolves into, well, gone too far, can't stop now, and then fully erodes into nothing will stand in my way. How dare you try to stop me? I am the hero.
I mean, it's an interesting example, right? Because it's a story where which starts as person as what we've talked about already. A person starts with one crime, and it's so easy for that to spiral into another, 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 and then it grows into now in the head of the monster.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to do it that way.
I think as well, like another fairly similar example, even is actually Dexter, because he also has a code where he only kills people who are criminals, and not petty criminals, generally speaking, bad criminals, murderers and rapists, abusers, that sort of thing. But he's not doing it because he wants to make the world a better place. He's not deluding himself into thinking he's a good person. He does it because he loves killing and he has been taught that this is the only way that this is okay. He's had that beaten into him. And he maybe wouldn't have been the person he became if he had had a better support network who had actually taught him, not to be a murderer instead of who it was okay to murder. And that becomes both
Yeah.
an interesting exploration of this killer's psyche as he explores his own morality and things like that. But he also that it's another example of that code gets stretched to breaking point often because he is desperate to cover up his crimes and stay free to keep killing.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, even if his victims are only other serial killers, Dexter is a serial killer, not not purely by act. When I've heard some people talk about it, they like to think about it that way. Like, no, he's punishing other serial killers, and like, yeah, he is,
He thinks he is anyway.
but
You think he's never been
that's not
wrong?
really. But also, that's not really why he does it. He, as a personality trait, a part of who he is a serial killer. At best, going after and targeting other serial killers is his excuse, his justification to give into that darker urge, release and be that part of him without feeling like he's a monster.
Well, I mean, he accepts he's a monster. He's okay with that.
Yes, but also I don't think he really could fully accept a monster that he's a monster. I think he partially does that because he really wouldn't be okay with the idea of just butchering innocent people the way he does people he thinks are killers.
It's hard to say because he's been raised to be this version of himself.
That's true. We never get the chance to see what we honestly never get the chance to see the nature versus nurture thing with Dexter.
I mean, there's obviously some nature in there. He enjoyed hurting people, killing small animals, all that typical stuff as a young person.
Oh, I forgot about the small animals part.
He was, branded to be this some form of this, likely, quite possibly, from a very young age. But the question with him is, as he's exploring his own morality and his own idea of, is it okay to stretch the code here? Is it okay not to? Should I let this person live? Who am I hurting? Is like as he explores more and more of his own morality and values around his identity as a serial killer, more and more you start to question because he becomes more human over time, better, more positive influences in his life and people he cares about. Can't let go of the killer necessarily, but he starts to be less of one. And you sort of go, if Cop Dad Harry had raised you not to be a serial killer, if he didn't give you the code, give you this framework to exist in as an excuse, maybe you could have been someone better.
Yeah, he definitely could have put his talents to a good, more altruistic use too. He's very smart.
hmm But yeah, most crime stories, when told from the perspective of the criminal, they don't go to those dark places for various reasons. It's easier to make a likable protagonist, for one thing. They generally go the route of the reluctant criminal or
Hmm.
the petty criminal who gets in over their head, or they go the charming rogue archetype. And charming rogues are fun. They're typically the leads to thrillers or comedies, even built around like a heist or heist is where you usually find this character.
Yeah, the charming rogues tend to embody like freedom more than anything else. Almost like the fact that they're criminals is just a matter of happenstance more than anything else.
Most of the time, because they're found in heists, that means that the people who are becoming their victims are usually the people who are super wealthy. They have loads of money. Chances are they've probably stomped on a lot of people to get it. So most of us don't feel that bad about rooting for the charming thief.
It's it's hard to feel bad for the victims of Robin Hood.
Yeah, like these guys, they if they take a painting from a billionaire, even though that painting is probably worth millions, they're not really doing that much harm to the billionaire, even if they are selfishly enriching themselves.
Yeah, is that billionaire's family gonna suddenly be homeless?
No.
No.
And those are your sort of Ocean's 11s, Inceptions, Red Notices, that sort of thing. But you gave the example of Robin Hood, and that is a fantastic example of the charming rogue archetype, arguably the originator of it. And he's also benevolent. He's stealing from very rich people, but he explicitly is giving that wealth to to people in poverty. So he is also quite heroic.
He almost gets a couple bonus points for being somebody who literally originally came from privilege and tossed it aside to help give more and more privilege and everything to the other people who have none after being both personally harmed but also kind of just enraged by seeing, at least in my classic understanding of Robin Hood, what became of his home while he was gone.
He's like the original exploration in a lot of ways of the sort of thief criminal archetype as a sort of anti-hero. He is committing crimes. There is no debating that. He is taking things from the rich and giving them to the poor. Things that belong to someone else, he is taking those away and giving them to someone who has no claim to them. But because he is stealing from an oppressive, like rich upper class and giving to the victimized poor, who have much more need for that money, even though he's committing a crime, he becomes heroic and turns the idea of the criminal on its head in a lot of ways. The not necessarily the first, but one of the earlier examples of that idea of legality versus morality that stories about crime often explore. One of those interesting examples where the criminal becomes the hero as a result.
It's always interesting to see the different perspectives and angles on this stuff too. It's one of the things that one of the actual benefits of like the inherent what you call it, the inherent like friction that crime creates is it's one of the most varied genres I could think of. You really can go
It's more of a
basically
topic than a genre.
any fair, yeah, but you can basically go any direction you want with a crime story because crimes can come from a near infinite number of places, lead to a near infinite number of results, and people from all places, all walks of life, all like shades of morality come into and are affected by or involved with crime in one way or at one time or another. And I think to a point you can kind of say that about everything, but since that's something that's very true about crime in real life while it is happening all the time as well, I think it's just such a playground for authors.
Can confirm. I mean, it's exactly as you said, right? Criminals in reality come from all kinds of backgrounds and commit their crimes for all kinds of different reasons, and that makes them an interesting characters to explore in fiction. Oftentimes, you like with your characters who are your more reluctant criminals, the ones who start small scale petty crime and then get in over their heads as things spiral out of control, or who didn't really want to be criminals to begin with. They're often tragic figures. those stories can, sometimes they're thrillers, but often they're traditional dramas and specifically tragedies, often of the classical definition. I think a lot of the Outsiders, sort of older story that a lot of us have read, often for school.
I read it in school.
Yeah, so did I. But it's a very good story, and it is all
It
about
is.
this idea of, these guys are, they're thugs, they do a little bit of crime, but it's mostly petty stuff. But because they are involved in crime and in a gang, effectively, they end up involved in events that spiral out of control into tragic situations, and people die. And that sucks because they're people who have friends and family members who suffer because of it.
Yeah, it's a weird sad thing about the inherent nature of crime, especially in like the lower rungs of society, is no matter how small scale or white collar your crime is, even if you're doing things that you could at least convince yourself are victimless or only include victims who deserve it. If you're a criminal, you're a criminal. And I don't just mean that by in ways the law would see it, because the law separates criminals into different tiers and everything. But like, once you're in, you're a part of the life, and you never know, no matter how small scale you are, when somebody worse might step around the block. It can go bad real fast.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like every petty thief is going to suddenly find themselves spiraling into more and more violent situations. But by stepping into even the life of petty crimes, you are opening the door to the chance that that spiral will happen, whether you want it to or not.
And that somebody could drag you deeper whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, so you need the money. Your family are starving. It is entirely justifiable that you need to commit this crime. You need to steal. I don't know. You need to rob this bank or whatever. Okay, justifiable, understandable. You need the money for noble reasons. But what happens when the police arrive whilst you're still at the bank? Do you now take hostages?
Yeah. Well, and even going smaller than that. Oh, you did a little raid on like a local small store that you know is kind of corrupt and has plenty of money, and you didn't really hurt anybody. Oh, it turns out that a local gang or crime family was using that store as a front or took a lot of protection money from them, and some of what you took is what should have been paid to them, and now they know. Well, you can't just say sorry, I didn't mean it when the guys with baseball bats or spiked knuckles or guns show up.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways crime, even arguably justifiable crime, can go horribly wrong. And that does sort of bring us to the other side of the aisle, right? Because obviously, the opposite side of things is stories about crime can also be told from the perspective of the detective. And to be clear, like as a note, that doesn't necessarily mean an actual police officer, although it usually is. But the detective archetype can very easily just be it's anyone who's trying to solve the crime. Usually cops, but they could also be journalists, family members of victims, past victims themselves, or just people who have a weird obsession.
Or Batman.
Or
Oh wait, you
Batman.
said weird obsession.
But, he's just a cool person with a weird obsession.
Yeah, it could be anybody from Batman to some teenager who sees something happen and gets curious.
Yeah,
Like,
Batman and Nancy Drew are both parts of the same archetype. You enjoy that information.
you can't deny it. They could hang out. They could go on a buddy cop adventure together.
All right, Nancy, this is how you use a taser.
Listen, he already hung out with the Scooby Doo gang multiple times. It'd be easy to hang out with Nancy Drew. It would be a relief to him. He'd be like, "Oh, someone I can actually talk to."
So typically, right, when you're talking about it from the perspective of the detective, from the person trying to solve the crime, you're usually this means the story is going to take the form of not an action story, a mystery story, or sometimes you might get an action story, or sometimes it's a hybrid, right? generally speaking, a crime has been committed, and the detective character is trying to piece together the mystery of who committed the crime and why they committed it. Which, to do that, they also need to piece together the how, as you said.
Yeah, yeah, true. In detective stuff especially, it always kind of comes back to the how, and to a lesser extent the why. But the why is an interesting dramatic consequence, whereas the how is the ultimate goal.
Yeah, when you're telling the story from the side, especially like a mystery is one of those things that is so easy to be gripped by. I would say the mystery element of these things is a huge part of why crime thriller stories, as both books and also in TV and movie, like police procedural style, are so popular because you want to know the answer. When a mystery is presented to us, there's very few people who could go, eh.
Yeah, and some of the best like mysteries and detective type things, it's more or less just honestly actually kind of the same appeal as a sing along. With the best ones, you're in your head doing everything right alongside the detective, trying to think about it, trying to piece it all together, see what you can figure out on your own,
Oh yeah,
and what like contribute as the detective goes the thing. That's why most Sherlock Holmes stuff is from the perspective of Watson, because we're supposed to be Watson.
I'm sure I'm not the only person who has, without even intending to, found themselves basically racing the detective protagonist to see if you can figure out the crime first.
I have never tried to jump ahead of a story and figure stuff out ahead of time as hard as I did while watching Higurashi.
Yeah, it's very
I was burning holes in my brain trying to figure things out before they were revealed.
which is very hard to do with that particular piece of media because
I got
everyone's
a couple
insane.
things ahead of time, but oh man,
I do it
it's
often
fun.
with
That's
like
my favorite part of a mystery.
yeah, I often do that with like crime thrillers, like especially the mystery variety. I'm like I can't help but try and piece together the evidence, and sometimes I just find myself trying to see if I can solve it before the police in the story do. And sometimes I succeed, often even, because I have genre literacy that the characters don't. But not always. Sometimes
Yeah.
they really get me, and I'm sitting there going, "Oh," at the end, and that's a different. That's also satisfying in its own way.
It is. It's really satisfying, especially when it's because the thing that really sparks the "oh" is when as soon as it's revealed is not that you know the answer now, it's that the second the answer is revealed, you can also instantly understand how it got there. It's just not the path you ended up going on.
Yeah, at least when it's done right.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of funny because I'm the same way, and I've realized it's a small bit of a lose-lose situation, at least when you're sharing or watching a story like that with someone else, because if you're talking about these ideas you're having out loud as it's happening, if the other person's not doing the same thing, they're going to be like, shut up and just watch.
Yeah.
But if you end up being right later and go, ah, I knew it, they're going to be like, yeah, sure. Sure you did.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like,
I mean, of course, like the mystery is that you're so right. Um, the mystery, of course, is generally a very central piece of all this, solving the crime. But of course, as I said, there is also typically thriller and or action elements attached to this. The idea that you're on a clock because you have to, the police or the detective of whatever variety they are, they have to figure out the crime and catch the criminal before the criminal strikes again, which creates this race against the clock, this idea of stakes, because if they fail to solve the crime quick enough, it's going to happen another time.
yeah, and ultimately, the whole point of catching a criminal is to stop them from committing crimes. Technically, if you still catch them after they commit another crime, that's not another full failure, but tell that to the victims who you were trying to protect and didn't.
Yeah. So that's your thrill element, and oftentimes you'll get like action sequences as chase scenes or even shootouts, fight scenes, that sort of thing attached to that as well. There's, from the perspective of the hero, the detective, there's a lot of gripping storytelling and media that can be told that can get people very investment. And the story, and it doesn't even have to end with the crime itself, because there could also be drama elements told here because you can explore the effect of the case on the detective and how that affects their personal and professional relationships.
Yeah, why do you think so many detectives are depressed and work alone? I mean, it's part of the archetype at this point to an extent, but
Well, a
also
sub archetype,
it's
arguably, but yeah.
yes, but also it's tough. It's That's a life that tends to wear on people, even the people. Often the people who are most suited to that kind of life are also the same kind of people who are going to be ground and eroded by it the more they do it.
I would argue that I think we've had this discussion before as well, back in that drama cycle, right? In fiction, yeah, it's usually the very emotionally invested characters who end up as detectives and all that. In reality, those are the last people you want. You want them to be invested enough that they give a shit, but not so emotionally invested that it's going to cause them to blow the case.
No, I mean, just don't kiss anybody during your investigation, dummy.
The SVU gang make for great TV. They would make for terrible actual police.
Well, that's why I really said slowly eroded over time because I think even like the tough, unemotional people, that's why it happens slowly. I think those tough people who don't get too emotionally involved are the ones who are the most suited to it. I just also think like even just having that slight bit of care, even if you don't ever get personally involved, people don't go unchanged by seeing these bad things happen, by dealing with these victims and in some cases these bad people who do these awful things. And like it's a life you can only live for so long, and I think that's why that's such a popular sub archetype because there's a lot of people who could do the job, and if they're good at it, even that is going to wear them down over time, or they might have just been a dour, quiet, slightly depressed person to begin with before they ever became a detective.
Yeah, I think that is fair. You make a good point in that it is that sort of even people who are more resilient and reserved and can keep it together while on the job, it definitely is going to have an effect over time, and it does to real people in that profession, in those professions, especially those who are dealing with like really bad, like violent crime, child abuse, that sort of thing. Gonna need trigger warnings on this episode.
Yeah.
It's it does wear people down who deal with like really messed up criminals and victims who've just been through hell. Like yeah, and as horrible as it is for reality, does make for a compelling protagonist.
Yeah, because that's just another thing to explore, especially because you can explore it either way. Because it it's such an inherently like if you're running into real crimes, real like rough stuff, it's such an inherently pressurized, tough, grating thing that then if somebody is not affected by it and seems to be a totally normal, chipper person while doing all that, then you have to ask why that is instead. Instead of going, why are you so depressed and dour and bitter? You have to be like, wait, why don't you seem to be affected by seeing all these hurt people and all these psychopaths at all? Are you okay?
Yeah. And speaking of the victims, that is the other thing we should talk about, right? Because some stories are told from the perspectives of victims as the sort of third point in our triangle of who is involved in a crime.
The least covered point of the triangle, but that's only because a lot of the most popular crimes are murders, and you don't always get to talk to the victims
Yeah,
at all. But
it's pretty difficult to in those scenarios, admittedly. Generally speaking, right, there is two ways that a story from the perspective of the victim will go. Two ways primarily, and then a third one tacked on, I'll say. You've got the horror version, like the horror thriller kind of version about escaping. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, but you got the horror drama, I should say, horror drama thriller trifecta about surviving the criminal or failing to, where the tension and the drama comes from that struggle to not die or be hurt or any other horrible fate. This is where slasher stories come in a lot of the time because you've got your serial killers like Michael Myers and all that. It's also where you get stories like Hush or Panic Room, where you get characters who are basically stuck in a certain environment with a violent threat, and this challenge then becomes, can I get out of here physically okay, even though mentally I'm probably going to need some therapy.
A lot of therapy. And no, do not put the hockey mask on, Mr. Therapist. That's the wrong kind of therapy.
Which, but I mean, that does lead me into the other category, right? The other major category, because there are also frequently stories, and they are the drama about dealing with the aftermath of the crime.
Oh yeah, that's always fun. Halloween's a good example of that because you kind of get both.
Yeah, I mean, he was a victim, right?
Well, that, but I was also going to say we get to go into the future and see the first survivor of the first Halloween and what became of her family and her after she grew up and how she has become this paranoid paranoid person who's alienated her family and who people think is a local kook because she is convinced that he is going to come back and she never feels safe and she has booby traps at her house and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that is fair. I mean, not to go back to my own work again, but screw it. It's my podcast. I can do whatever I want to. Domino also fills this category. Uh,
Hell yeah.
it is a story that is entirely about surviving the aftermath of a crime and the emotional toll that has on the characters within. Because this might come as a shock to you, but being a survivor of a horrible, violent crime, not a good time.
And nukes are one of the most aftermathy disasters that exist.
Yep, not a fun time. And another example that I brought up this one earlier as well, but Gone Girl is a little of this column, a little of the previous one, and also a little bit of the next.
I hate I hate what just jumped into my head thinking about nuclear aftermaths.
Oh god.
I just imagined somebody like I just imagined a little nuclear story ending with like, and then everybody was okay, and like the main character and someone they fell in love with along the way being at the doctor afterwards, and doctor being like, well, I've got some good news and some bad news. I'm gonna give you the good news first, and just looking straight at the man in this situation and going, you're not gonna need a vasectomy.
And the bad news is you're not going to need a vasectomy.
Yeah.
Uh, that's so fucked up. Um, but yes, I mentioned Gone Girl as a part of three columns, right? Because there is a third, I would argue, slightly lesser explored column than the other two when it comes to crime stories from the perspective of the victim, and that is the column that is typically some sort of action thriller, but could even be played as like a pure thriller or even a, I don't know why it's an action thriller. That's not really a thing that exists. Well, it kind of is, but you know what I mean. Action thriller or even horror is what I was going for, and that is the revenge
Right.
story when
Oh
the
yes.
victim becomes the criminal, but their crimes feel justified because to both them and also typically the audience because they are targeting the people who first wronged them, and maybe that spirals off to targeting other criminals of that same sort of breed.
Yeah, and then we get to have both at once the is revenge worth it story, but also the slippery slope story of how far are you going to go and can you stop?
I mean, you could also throw in a detective protagonist in there if you want, and have that be like, and also solve the crime and catch the killer.
I do sometimes like dual stories with stuff like that where technically you've got your two protagonists who are in direct opposition but also not strictly like opposite ends of the moral spectrums or enemies in the classic sense.
Yeah, I mean, crime by virtue of being that trifecta, right? Of the crime and who is affected by them is the criminal, the people solving the crime, and the victim. By virtue of that trifecta, that wonderful narrative character triangle existing gives you the opportunity to start exploring the same event from all these different perspectives.
Yeah, especially when you have a victim seeking revenge, because technically they're a criminal. They are in opposition to Mr. or whoever, whatever hero detective person, Crime Stopper. Crime Stoppers are us. Um, but there's a bigger criminal, a bigger antagonist who can still be the antagonist to both of them. And like those are fun angles to play with. I mean, hell, you could also sometimes show the perspective of the bigger criminal if you wanted, but that's a little harder. Having genuinely more than two protagonists in a coherent story can be difficult.
It can be, but I do think like a crime story is a very good story to tell that to like break up that way because it is one of the because it's built around the central event of the crime, right? So by nature you can then explore, and because of that triangle of people who are affected by the crime, by nature you can explore that same event through different perspectives quite easily because these are all different people engaging with the exact same event who will all experience that same event in different ways. And that can actually make for a really interesting story because you can have your perspective of the crime shifted dramatically depending on which perspective you're looking at it from, right? Like you can start a story from the perspective of like a victim, and the way you feel about that the crime can be dramatically altered if, say, you suddenly switch to the criminal and realize that, oh, you're not such an innocent person after all. You're actually a terrible, terrible human being who likely deserved all this horrible shit that was done to you.
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of ways to go with it. Or you could even also, and you could also have moments where like criminal we're following does something that seems justified and seems to not really have any serious repercussions in the moment, only for to jump to a detective digging through a much worse aftermath than we would have expected and piecing together and showing us how things got even worse.
Or presenting a more objective view of the situation where you're like, no, you both suck,
Yeah.
actually.
It's like, oh wow, actually, there are no good guys here, huh?
Except me, the detective. Except not really, because think of all those other horrible violations of privacy and etiquette and police code and just general law you've done trying to solve this crime as our hero detectives so frequently do.
That's true. That's true. The only way to solve this big crime is to commit smaller crimes.
By the dozen. Yeah, sometimes like by exploring all these different perspectives based around like the central crime, you can craft some really interesting narratives and really play with the audience experience and expectations and things like that. It can be a lot of fun as the audience to experience that, but also as the writer to craft that. And sometimes as an audience, instead, what you get is it's really satisfying to see John Wick kill the guy who killed the dog.
You know, revenge is not always worth it.
No,
The
I mean,
morals want me to say never. The morals want me to say never worth it, but unfortunately that's actually just not true.
yeah, but I would argue the extremes in the John Wick. I mean, it's very satisfying to watch. It's very engaging and very well crafted cinema. But the revenge may be a little disproportionate when he's killing all these different mooks as well, just to get to the one guy.
It's a weird situation though, right? Because the criminal he's after is the reason it's disproportionate. If he could just go straight to that guy and get him, he would.
True.
It's like because but even though it's not part of why he's taking revenge, part of why he has no choice is because he was marked as a target already at the same time as the bad thing he wants revenge for happened.
Because they saw it coming, yeah. And to be fair, it's very easy to hand wave our concern about all the collateral damage in his revenge quest because everyone he hurts or kills in his pursuit of revenge in this particular story is explicitly part of a crime family or working for a crime
Yeah,
family. So you sort of go, well, they
and
were criminals anyway.
explicitly targeting him already.
Yeah.
Like it's it's an interesting thing. I do kind of wish more stories would do that. I really You don't get to see it very often, but I like to see when a protagonist or a not explicitly villainous, horrifying character's reputation still precedes them. Like I love the moment of big scary boss man being told about what's going on and just being like,
Oh,
"You what? You made John Wick angry? Oh fuck, why did this have to
yeah, no,
happen?"
like specifically when he gets the call from John Leguizamo's character, he just goes, "Oh," and hangs up.
Yeah, literally just, "Oh." Click. In his head racing 50 miles an hour. Now I get to deal with all this shit.
Let's be honest, what he's actually doing is mentally burying his son.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean we've covered a lot here. We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered all the things I particularly wanted to. I think we can, and I assume that you wanted to, since this was actually your suggestion of a cycle.
I love talking about crimes.
Yeah, so, but I do think we can probably leave this one there.
I'd say so.
All right, so if you guys are listening to this on YouTube, Spotify, wherever else it shows up, you could also find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com. I also post stories there. Sometimes they feature crimes. Most of those stories are transcripts of the ones read out for the podcast, but some other stuff gets in there as well. I post blogs and articles and things like that as well there, and there are links there to buy my books, which always appreciate that. It does help me continue doing this as well. And you can find John streaming under Sephir, Sephear, on Twitch, as well as posting those VODs to YouTube. And he is very engaging and makes good content. So you should go and look at all that too.
That's right. Follow us. It's the only way to be either a cool detective or a cool criminal. If you don't, you're just a bad criminal or a narc.
And no one likes them.
That's right.
Right, well, don't do crimes, and we'll see you later.